Lakes Association Love Your Lake series, an educational series that we're doing in partnership with APIPP, as well as all of the other groups listed at the bottom of the screen. Our agenda for today is we'll do a little bit of an introduction on the Adirondack Lakes Alliance, on APIPP and our roles together. And then we'll get into a conversation with Dan Kelting from the Adirondack Watershed Institute on the manual control of milfoil through scuba divers and hand harvesting. Then ERIN from APIPP is going to talk about the biological control that can be done through weevils, moths, and more. We're really pleased to have Steve and Dave join us from Minerva to talk about the work that they're doing on chemical control related to milfoil and using ProcellaCOR. And then Lee is going to wrap up with a piece on navigating the permitting process. So all, great information. We're so pleased to have our speakers with us today. We'll have Q&As after each one of their sessions, and then we'll end the workshop with just a general Q&A for everybody. One thing to note is that we are recording this session, so you will be able to play this back or share it with other individuals from both the ALA and the APIPP websites is where we'll have those out there for you to access. So with that, I'll start with a little bit about the Adirondack Lakes Alliance. We've been around for 5 or 6 years. Our purpose is to bring together the lake and river associations in the Adirondack Park in a way that we can share information and resources, but also to partner with some key players that are working towards the same means we are in protecting and preserving the Adirondack Park. Every year, we get together for a one-day seminar where we host our membership and talk about things that are relevant to the lakes and river associations. Unfortunately, with COVID, we've had to change to a more virtual format, which has been good, and one that we present workshops and webinars like we're doing today. And so with that, in partnership with APIPP, we're presenting this Managing Milfoil workshop today, and I'd like to introduce Emily Bell, who's here from the APIPP team.
Good morning, everybody. I apologize for any technical difficulties or sound issues we might be having. I just got a note that my microphone is low, so I'm not sure what that means, but my name is Emily Bell-Dynan. I am a new addition to the Adirondack Park Invasive Plant Program, or APIPP as it's commonly known here in the Adirondacks. Just some background on our program if you haven't heard of our organization or department within the Nature Conservancy Adirondack office. We're funded by the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation and then housed and co-founded and managed by the Nature Conservancy. Our office is in Keene Valley. However, at this time, our office is closed. And so a lot of folks are working from home. If you're getting different types of contact information than you're used to in the past. The goals of the Adirondack Park Invasive Plant Program, or APIPP, are to prevent new introductions of invasive species, either aquatic or terrestrial, to the Adirondack region. And in the middle of this map here, you'll see our geography. We're not responsible for all of New York State, but I'll get to that in just a second. So preventing new introductions of invasive species, target invasive species to our region. And we do that in a number of different ways, but we rapidly detect and eradicate new infestations when they do occur. So we use a lot of mapping software. We rely on the eyes and ears of trained individuals and volunteers throughout our region. And we manage existing priority infestations in order to mitigate those impacts. There's a lot of different tiers in which we define and look at and analyze and set goals based on what type of invasive species it is, how feasible it is to eradicate and control those invasives, and then the economic, environmental, and social impacts those species have. We we try to reach work to reach our goals through a number of different programs here at APIPP. We have a terrestrial invasive species program that works with plants and animals, aquatic invasive species program that also works with plants and animals. So you'll hear some of my colleagues call us an all taxa program. That's sort of some scientific jargon for all plants and animals working in aquatic and terrestrial spaces. And then we reach the public through education outreach programs. Our program hasn't had a full-time education outreach person until just this year. So we'll be building a lot of our education outreach throughout our PRISM geography going forward. So you might be hearing a lot more from us because our capacity has grown. And we are just one of 8 PRISM partners, or Partnership for Regional Invasive Species Management, across New York State, which are funded and overseen by the Department of Environmental Conservation and housed within a lot of different home partner orgs. I have below a number, or I believe all of their, if I could find them, all of their logos. And so if you're zooming in from another geography, which has been, you know, typically the case for our new online world, we can put you in touch with our analogous organizations, say in Western New York or the Finger Lakes or even Long Island and Lower Hudson. So that will be part of the outreach materials or follow-up materials I'll send out in addition to recordings of this program following up from our workshop today. That's all I have to say about APIPP. It's a very, very big topic. That's why there are so many logos.
Well, thank you, Emily. It was a nice overview of APIPP. Appreciate it. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dan Kelting, who's going to talk to us about scuba divers and hand harvesting. And I think we're going to have to do a little bit of a control change here.
Just put in my request.
Okay, I just approved it.
All right.
And then I'll just note while we're waiting for Dan to move the presentation over, I will be facilitating Q&A today. And as Mary mentioned, after each segment, we have a shorter Q&A built in so that we can put those questions to that specific topic because we're covering so much today. But we also have a larger Q&A for at the end. So feel free to just keep popping in your questions into the chat box or wait to the end to verbalize it yourself, and I'll be tracking all that information.
Right, am I live?
I believe so.
Right, well, good morning, everybody. I only see 3 people on my screen, Emily, Mary, and myself, so it's new days, as has been said already by Mary, but actually I think this is a pretty efficient way to have learning happen without having to drive and be in the comfort of your own home. I first wanted to start out by thanking Mary from ALA and also Emily and ERIN from APIPP for hosting this session. I think it's important to get the word out, and both ALA and APIPP have been really great at educational outreach to various stakeholders around the park on invasive species issues. So the Adirondack Watershed Institute program I direct here at Portsmouth College has been involved with aquatic invasive species management for over 20 years, using principally scuba divers and hand harvesting, which is the title of my talk, but also combining that with benthic barriers, which is another form of mechanical control for aquatic invasive plants. Up until fairly recently, scuba diver hand harvesting was really the standard method to control aquatic invasive plants. And although we're going to hear from Steve and Dave from Minerva in a little bit, they're going to talk about a new variant of hand harvesting using a dash unit, which is an improved version of diver-assisted hand harvesting. One of the nice features of scuba diver hand harvesting is there's a general permit available through the park agency, which makes permitting comparatively rapid for other methods. And I know VENNE-VOLLRATH is going to be talking about permitting later. So what I'm going to do is give a pictorial overview, talk about scuba hand harvesting, show you some images, talk about costs associated with this particular method and challenges, and the costs and the challenges go hand in hand, so I'll link them together. And I'll end with talking about monitoring, which is a very important part of any kind of management that you do, whether it's hand harvesting, chemicals, or biological. A good monitoring program is important for understanding whether you're successful in being able to course correct through different management actions as you're going through your program. So this is a typical view of a small hand harvesting operation. Can you see my cursor? No? So in the middle of the screen, yes?
Yes, you can.
Okay, cool. So in the middle of the screen, you see there's an inner tube. On the inner tube is what's called a hookah rig, which is a surface supplied air source for divers. This has become the common method for diving. We used to use tanks, but tanks are very inefficient. They're expensive to get filled. You can only stay underwater for a couple hours versus a hookah system. You can stay underwater for several hours, and it's much more comfortable for the divers to utilize versus tanks. So most operations use a hookah system. And then there's typically a number of boats surrounding the area, somebody working to collect the plants that are harvested, and oftentimes there'll be volunteers. In this particular case, this is work we were doing in Shaggy Lake in the Narrow. It's a very high traffic area. So these two gentlemen are serving a purpose of crowd control, keeping folks away. Safety is a big concern, as you can imagine, with whenever you have scuba divers in the water. But there's the rig, and so underneath the water here, this rig is actually supporting 4 scuba divers. And if we go underwater, here's a view of one of the divers. There's a hose here. That hose is going back to the hookah rig, again, supplying the air to the diver. In the background, you can see the left hand is holding basically a lobster bag or a clamshell bag that stays open. And then in the right hand, the diver is about ready to harvest an individual stem of Eurasian Watermilfoil. And what the diver is going to do is, as best they can, they're going to try to remove as much root material as possible, because these plants will resprout from any residual roots. So they're going to reach their hand down around the side and kind of literally tickle the plant up out of the sediment. They're going to wrap it up into a ball, and they're going to put that ball into the bag, and they're going to keep doing that and doing that. And the plant is buoyant, so once the bag is full, the diver is actually just going to be lifted to the surface. And then what they'll do is transfer that full bag to someone, what we call the top water person, who's typically in a kayak. So here you can see 2 divers. They're transferring their full bags to the top water person. This individual is going to give them empty bags. They're going to go back down and keep working. So it's not a lot of glamour. It's basically underwater weed harvesting, exactly how it sounds. And but it's actually kind of interesting. You kind of get in the zone, so to speak, when you're doing it. But you can see the hoses, all these hoses kind of wrapped around here. I'm going to talk about some implications related to those in a minute. So here we have the bags are being transferred to the surface. The divers go back down, and then this individual brings the bags to a boat, and they get dropped off. They weigh anywhere from 30 to 40 pounds each, so they're pretty heavy. They get accumulated in the boat, and at the end of the day, we have a boat full of bags of in this case, this is variable leaf milfoil down in Long Lake. And something you can see here, which is, and I should have brought it up in the first slide with the diver underwater, but divers, they have eyes on the plants, so they're able to selectively remove the invasive species and retain the native species, which is a nice feature of diver assisted hand harvesting, being a selective method so the natives can recolonize the area after the invasive has been removed. So a good crew working in a dense area is going to remove anywhere from 1 to 2 tons of plant material a day. So very productive, very repetitive, and this configuration that I just showed you with 4 divers and 1 top water person is about $6,000 a week in terms of costs for the program. So it's expensive, and you can see it's very labor intensive. In terms of costs for control, so that's a weekly cost, but the actual cost of control for any given water body is going to depend on the density of the plants throughout the lake. So here's a simple control cost budget that we use to estimate costs for various water bodies. On the y-axis, we have hand harvesting costs in dollars per acre. And then we categorize the milfoil density around the lake into 5 classes: rare, occasional, common, abundant, and dense. In terms of the costs associated with these, they vary greatly. So it costs about $2,000 per acre to control a dense bed, and those costs reduce exponentially as you go down to where milfoil is rare, so you're going around and see here and there, that'd be rare. $100 to $200 an acre for rare. So what we do with hand harvesting management is what we're trying to do is drive that density down. So over time with repeated harvesting, we go from dense to abundant to common to occasional to rare. That's the idea. And the rate at which you're going to go down that curve really depends on the biology of the invasive species and how you're able to handle the biology of the species as you're doing management. And what we're talking about is fragmentation, seed production, and rhizomes and residual roots in the sediment. So how fast do we go down the curve? So fragments are the main mechanism by which the milfoil species are spread throughout the lake. So in the fall of the year, both the Eurasian and variable and the natives too go through what's called auto-fragmentation. And you can see on this particular picture, you see these little white things. These are rootlets. So the plants fall apart. The fragments drift through the water column. They lose buoyancy. They anchor to the bottom, and then you have a new plant established in another location. That happens naturally, but it also happens throughout the summer period through mechanical means. So when the plants get to the surface, wave action can break them apart. Motorboats driving through them, and any kayaks, canoes, any physical thing that touches them can help break apart the fragments. And if you're out in any of our lakes, you'll see fragments kind of floating around throughout the summer from mechanical fragmentation. This is a problem when we think about a challenge related to diver hand harvesting with all those hoses. When those divers are underwater, they actually cause a lot of fragmentation, as you can imagine, because they're pulling those hoses through the beds of plants, ripping them up, and there's just a lot of large fragments that float to the surface. So when diver hand harvesting is utilized as a method, whoever's doing the work has to address the fragmentation that occurs, and that can be done in the slide that I showed you in the beginning. All those boaters that were around there, they had a whole cadre of volunteers that were collecting fragments as they came to the surface, and they're working downwind because the fragments are going downwind. So you can have people picking them up, or you can also put a boom in. Thank you. You can put a boom in to collect the fragments as they're moving down. Next one is seed production. So milfoil does produce seeds. These seeds are going to be in the substrate, so you're going to get, even though you're harvesting, you're going to have new plants re-emerging. So you're going to have persistence of the species over time, which is going to take longer to control. In terms of management, what we try to do is harvest the plants before they go to seed. So that's the only choice we have in terms of management, but recognizing we'll have persistent regrowth. The other mechanism is rhizomes. So if you look at a plant bed, a bed of milfoil, it could very well be one plant. It's all connected together by rhizomes. So when the divers are down there harvesting, they're trying their best to get as much material as possible, but they're leaving material behind, and that's going to cause resprouting and regrowth, and that's going to result in persistence of the species in the water column. So what we try to do is harvest regularly and get as much root material as you can, but there's going to be persistence and resistance associated with that. So just a quick example of thinking about this, putting it all together. Here's a map. So first thing you do is you go out and map and assess the density of milfoil around your water body. This is Sixth Lake in the Fulton chain. You can see it's color coded based on density. We know the acreages. Multiply the acres by cover by the dollars per cover. We can get an estimate of control costs. Here we're going to look at the actual control cost over time. We have cost on an annual basis starting with year one. And here's a worst case scenario where we're not doing a good job with fragment control. There's a lot of persistent seed growth. We're getting a lot of rhizome recovery, so the system is really resistant to our control efforts. Initial cost is $68,000 a year, and then it drops over time as we get the system under control. We compare that to a best case scenario. Initial cost is still the same, but we're getting good fragment management. We don't have a persistent seed pool, and we're addressing the rhizomes correctly. We can drive down that cost curve much more rapidly in a more best case scenario. If we compare the two, it takes about 8 years under the best case scenario to achieve what we call maintenance. So we've achieved rare. which at a cost of about $283,000. If we look at the worst case scenario, it takes about twice as long, 16 years, and almost twice as much in terms of cost to get to that scenario. And so the actual cost of management for any particular lake is going to be in between those two lines. You're not going to have the best case scenario. Hopefully you're not going to have the worst case scenario. You're going to be somewhere between 8 and 16 years and somewhere between $280,000 and $540,000. This illustrates one of the challenges with mechanical harvesting is a large unknown in terms of the cost. You have to realize that the plants don't want to be removed. They have a lot of mechanisms to keep themselves there, and you're fighting against nature in terms of trying to bring them under control. Last thing I'll say, and I'll wrap up. So part of the work of the dive team should also be a survey. So we use GIS and GPS to develop a detailed map. They do pre-harvest and post-harvest survey. They track their pounds removed, helps us with accountability for the divers, and helps us assess effectiveness. And I'll just show a quick example with Upper Saranac Lake, who we started working with a number of years ago. Here's a milfoil map produced in 2004. The darker the red, the more milfoil. Here's the same map produced in 2005. And here's the same map produced in 2006. You see there's less dark red. And then we're able to look at the distribution across our classes. In 2004, we were dominated by occasional milfoil. 2005 by rare, and by 2006, the most dominant density is rare. So we're able to see that the methodology that is being used is effective. And so I'm actually trying to get to my last slide. I only have one more slide. Oh, there we go. So I just went through it. So looking at the methods, how we do it, costs, challenges, and then again, I want to emphasize that monitoring is very important for assessing the effectiveness of the methodology, no matter what method you're using. So that's it. And I got to give it back to Mary.
Thank you, Dan. And Emily, do you want to go into the Q&A session now for Dan?
Yeah, if we could go to that, if that's the slide you end on, that would be great, the question slide. And I have 3 amazing questions that were presented to you, Dan, in particular. So the first would be, are there any indigenous species that are similar to invasive milfoil, and is there confusion while harvesting?
Yeah, so yeah, great question. There are several. So we have 3 native milfoil species in the Adirondacks, one of which doesn't look like any of the other 2. It's actually leafless milfoil, so you wouldn't confuse that one. But there is Spicatum, which looks a lot like, so northern water milfoil looks a lot like Eurasian Watermilfoil. Then there's Alterniflorum, which actually doesn't look like either one. We train our divers to be able to differentiate between the 2. There's also bladderwort that can be confused, although the divers tend not to confuse that one. That's more of the public. But we train our teams to differentiate. And what's nice is that when the plants are in the water column, they look quite a bit different than they do when you pull them out of the water. So the actual growth forms of the plants are different. The Eurasian has more of a straight architecture. The Spicatum tends to be more wavy. Alterniflorum just grows along the ground. Eurasian has a little short haircut on the top that Spicatum doesn't have. So we try to train our divers to differentiate, and that's the way you have to do it and educate. And we actually, in our program, we audit, so we'll look in the bags and make sure that what they're harvesting is what they're supposed to be harvesting. You do have to keep an eye on it, but training is important. Great question.
That's great. We have a few different we have a number of questions coming in. So just as a note to everyone, if it's more of a general question, like we have one about designating density, I'm going to hold that to the end, to the general Q&A, so a number of folks can answer. And then when we run out of time for these 5-minute intermediate questions, I'll put those at the end too, so they're not getting lost if you don't hear it now. So the second question we got was, when do you recommend hand harvesting based on this graph the graph you showed, and what do you recommend for other areas when you do not recommend hand harvesting? And I believe that that graph that is referred to is when you were talking about density, so the scale graph of size of infestation.
Right, like the bar chart?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's a really great question. It's actually a very challenging question. So I think the first, so when anybody asks, approaches me that are interested in managing their infestation of invasive species, the first thing I tell them that they need to do is they need to have it assessed or mapped. So what is the extent of your infestation, both spatially and in terms of density? So where are the plants and how dense are they? That is going to give you the baseline information that you need to start to have a really detailed discussion on what you can do. And the bottom line, unfortunately, what you can do comes to the resources that you have in hand to do it, and that's really financial. So having that baseline map done, and having that allows folks like me and others, if they're using chemicals or other means, to be able to do some calculations and some estimates to show you, okay, if you want to control this entire population in your lake, meaning get it down to its rare and then you can sustain it, this is how much it's going to cost to do it using this method. And you may come back and say, well, we can't afford that. We can only afford this. So then you have another discussion. Okay, what is it that you're what are your greatest concerns related to this species? And maybe there's a certain area of the lake that's higher value than others in terms of utilization. So it's not an easy answer. It comes to first to do an assessment of the conditions of the lake, use that assessment to gather information from various professionals, and that information is the options and the costs. Talk within your organization about your ability to support any kind of work, recognizing that no matter what you do, if you're interested in controlling these invasive species, this is not a one and done. This is really a forever activity, meaning that you're going to have to control in perpetuity at some level. So probably didn't answer your question very well, but I always start my answer to that question with, you need to get an assessment. And then from that, then things can happen in terms of discussion.
We actually had and we have 1 minute to answer this, I apologize, but having to do with your assessment that you just referred to, the question was, do you have more recent milfoil density maps since 2006? It looks like there were fewer dense sites, but milfoil has been spreading.
Oh, you're talking about the upper Saranac example. Yeah, so sure. So milfoil has not been spreading in upper Saranac Lake. What's interesting is that the methodology that they're utilizing now, so we ran that program for about 7 years, and when we started, it was there were so many more plants in the lake that we characterized plants by density class, and so you see those circles. What they do now is, because there's so fewer plants, they actually mark the locations of the individual stems. So with the map they use now, you see a lot of little red dots on it, which makes it look like there's more, but in fact there's actually less. So it's the way that they're mapping and presenting the data that's making it look like there's more, but it was just a change in methodology because of the reduced density in that particular lake.
So you're saying that science is ever changing?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So that's excellent. And we have more questions for you at the end, Dan.
Great, thank you.
This is awesome. I say awesome a lot when there's awesome things happening. So let's move on to our next speaker. I'll let you go ahead, Mary.
Okay, ERIN is going to present a piece on biological controls. So ERIN, thanks for joining us today. I'll start with your first slide.
Wonderful. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. And my part's going to be a bit shorter just because I'm going to give a little bit of information on a few herbivorous insects that people have used for biological control. and then talk about one case study that comes out of the Adirondacks here. So just starting out, the definition of biological control is really the reduction of pest populations by a natural enemy, and it typically involves an active human role. And I really want to highlight reduction because as Dan was talking about, a lot of the management that is done is just really knocking the population back and not getting rid of it. And so a successful biocontrol of Eurasian watermilfoil is defined as, reducing the abundance, hopefully eliminating that surface matting that we see, and then promoting a healthy native plant community, but not to eliminate the plant from the lake. And so as I mentioned, I'll just be talking about 2 herbivorous insects for this example. Sometimes when people talk about biological control, they will also think about a fish, a triploid grass carp. But I'm not going to be going into detail about that today because it's not typically used to manage Eurasian watermilfoil in the Adirondack Park. I think if Lee has time later, he will give a little bit more information about the triploid grass carp. But this will be all I'll say about it in this part. So the first insect that I'm going to talk about is the milfoil moth. It's native to Europe, but it was brought to the North America a long time ago in the 1930s. And so it's now considered to be a naturalized organism. So it is pretty widespread in New York State. And we do find it in our lakes, or many of our lakes here in the region. So this moth will lay its eggs at the base of the Eurasian watermilfoil plants, and then the young will at once they hatch, come to the top, the growing tips of the plant and feed on those. And the milfoil moth will only feed, as far as the research can tell, on Eurasian watermilfoil. It will overwinter at the base of the plant. And for the milfoil moth, studies have shown that you need about 1 moth per stem of Eurasian watermilfoil to get a significant impact for management. And then the other biocontrol that I want to talk about is the milfoil weevil. This one is native to North America, and we again find it in many lakes in the region. It feeds on more of the plant than the moth does. As an adult, it will feed on the leaves and the stem of the plant, and then the larva or the young will first feed on the growing tips of the plant, and then they'll burrow into the stem and eat the inside of the stem. It also will eat some natives. It's thought that its first host plant is the northern watermilfoil, and then once Eurasian watermilfoil was introduced, it seems to prefer that one to the native. For this insect, the adult will overwinter on land. So that's something to consider, which I'll talk about a little bit more later. And for the milfoil weevil, you need about 2 to 4 weevils per stem to see a significant impact on the plant. So there is one lake that a study was done in the Adirondacks, Lincoln Pond, which is just east of the Northway, more on the east, so the eastern edge of the Adirondacks. And a case study was done by Cornell University, the Essex County Cornell Cooperative Extension, also the Lincoln Pond Lake Association, and the Lake Champlain Basin Program did this study in 2000 and 2001. And so those who don't know Lincoln Pond, it's a 600-acre lake, and it's thought that the Eurasian watermilfoil was introduced in the mid-1980s, likely from one of the boat launches on the lake. And then a study done in 2000 saw that the milfoil had expanded to 130 acres of dense Eurasian watermilfoil in the lake. And so that's when this study started. And at the time of before additional introductions of these biocontrols into this lake, there were already populations of both the weevil and the moth in the lake. And so the existing populations were very small. It was about 0.07 moths per Eurasian Watermilfoil stem, and about 0.08 Weevils. So not many in the lake, but they were there already. And so for this study, over 60,000 milfoil moths, caterpillars, were introduced to the lake over those 2 years. So you can go to the next one, Mary. And so essentially what happened was that after 2 years of augmenting the population with the moth, they studied both the moth populations and the weevil populations over time, but neither population reached that theoretical critical mass of at least 1 per stem for the moth larva or 3 per stem for the milfoil weevils. And the study found that it was likely due to predation of these biocontrols due to the panfish populations, for the most part pumpkin seed in Lincoln Pond here. And so if you'll go to the next slide, I just wanted to talk about a few things to consider with the biocontrol approach for Eurasian Watermilfoil. And first of all, this is definitely a long-term strategy. It's a very slow process to hopefully get these biocontrols established and to the population sizes that you need to do significant damage to the plant. Also considering the sunfish that you have in your lake and whether or not they will lead to significant predation onto those biocontrols. First, if you have a lot of sunfish, this might not be a good method for you. But also there are some strategies that could be considered as more of a top-down control to try to reduce the sunfish population. For example, if you introduce a lot of bass, that could potentially reduce the sunfish population in your lake. Lincoln Pond also tried a fishing tournament in the lake to see how many fish, sunfish people could catch and just reduce that population. They didn't see good results from that, but it's something to think about. Also, it's important to consider overwintering habitat. As I mentioned, the weevils will overwinter on shore, so you need to have a good vegetation cover and leaf litter on shore to protect those overwintering weevils. Also, there's, this study was done in 2000-2001. There's been some additional research over that time, but there's very limited research on these biocontrols, and there hasn't been any real significant breakthroughs over the time. So this really has seemed to be a hopeful monitoring or hopeful management option that hasn't really, flushed out to be very successful in many places. I did want to mention the costs. The estimate that I saw for costs is about $1 per moth or weevil, and you would need about 1,000 of these insects per an acre of Eurasian Watermilfoil. So that comes out to about $1,000 per acre if you were able to get your population up to this size that it would need to be to do management. And that also leads to one of the challenges that I forgot to put on this slide, is that there's not many places that can provide you with either the weevil or the moth. There was a company that was mass producing weevils for this, but they closed in 2015. And as far as I know, there is not another source to get additional weevils to add to your lake. And then lastly, I just wanted to mention that there are some permits in place to stock with biocontrols. Both the DEC and the Adirondack Park Agency have permits that you would need for stocking these. And with that, I can take any questions about the two biocontrol insects.
Thank you, ERIN. It sounds like we need to get into the weevil growing business. So that actually leads us to the first question, which they asked some background of a few years ago in Lake Bonaparte. There was the community saw success with adult weevils, but not with the larval stage. introduced, when they were introduced in the larval stage, there was no success. Adult weevils had success. And now that these companies, these local companies have closed and local researcher is not raising the adults, do we know of any suppliers for adults? And would you recommend letting the natural population build up? And I'm guessing that the reducing the sunfish population is related to allowing the adult population to grow over time. So the question really is, do you know of any suppliers for the adults?
And not that I was able to see anywhere. I don't know if any of our other panelists know of any, but I have not heard of any.
And then ERIN, getting to that allowing the natural population to build up, is that what you were referring to with limiting the sunfish population?
Yeah, that seemed to be the biggest issue, was if you have a lot of sunfish that would just be eating the weevils and reducing their population, you just won't be able to get it to build up to the level that you would need. So it would both be, you know, depending on what your sunfish population is, and then also thinking about their overwintering habits.
ERIN has frozen for a moment. Overwintering habitat. For any of our other panelists here, if you all have recommendations for suppliers for adult weevils, though I know there's an APA permitting process before folks can go out and release biocontrols on their own. So maybe we can get to that question a little bit later. The other question here, ERIN, was, will the insects only feed on milfoil that you've discussed?
Am I back?
You're back, yes,
okay.
Welcome.
Okay, so I know off the top of my head, those are the Eurasian Watermilfoil is their preferred plants, but I don't know 100% if there are other plants aside from milfoils that they'll feed on. So as I mentioned, the weevils will also feed on the native northern Eurasian or northern milfoil, as well as the Eurasian Watermilfoil.
Okay. We have another question related to availability of biocontrols and requirements to use them. And I'm going to hold that question for the end when we get to Lee Wollrath from the Adirondack Park Agency. So if we move on from ERIN now, we'll have a little bit more time to give over to Lee to talk about requirements and regulations around biocontrols, if that's okay.
Sounds good.
Okay.
Let's move on to part 4 of our presentation, and thank you again, ERIN, for your presentation. We're really pleased to have the folks from Minerva here with us to talk about chemical control that they've experienced or testing on their lake. We have Steve McNally, the town supervisor, and Dave Labar, who is the town councilman for Minerva, joining us today. So welcome.
Thank you. Thanks. It's a privilege to be a part of this seminar and bring, you know, our experience with this new herbicide to this community of folks challenged with milfoil infestation in their lake. We are very excited about this. It has had every intended result and maybe more so than we had anticipated, and we hope in sharing this it can be used, you know, if specific application more widely in the park. I think it's going to open up new opportunities to save a lot of time and labor and eradication of the milfoil. So with that said, our lake, a little bit of history. We're in the southwest corner of Essex County. We have a man-made lake that's 80-some years old, or almost 90 now years old. It was a past form pasture basically that was never dredged. So in creating the lake, it became a very fertile environment for native weeds, and therefore when milfoil was introduced in 2007, it thrived in our lake, and we've been challenged with it ever since. I could talk a little more about history, but I want to thank ERIN and Lee for coming down and visiting with me in October 2018 and recognizing, you know, being outside of our little bubble in our world, that in the bigger picture, assets that we could use to control milfoil, and they met with me and suggested the use of chemicals and gave me a list of contractors and management companies that we could talk to about this, given that we had demonstrated our commitment to eradicate it through means of hand harvesting, benthic barriers, diver-assisted suction harvesting, and the like, to get rid of it, and really not seeing improvement, but yet maintenance and not really reaching our goal of eradication. With that said, in the following spring, I met Glenn Sullivan of Solitude Lake Management, who introduced us to this new herbicide that had been used in the South. It came from the agricultural world and was introduced in New York in 2019 and used on 2 different lakes, but not within the park. So that spurred the conversation of trying it, you know, tying it on milfoil within the park agency. So we met in August at DEC in Warrensburg and discussed the possibility, which led to the application and permitting process. I'll go on to the next slide. This is just a little background in our lake. This shows the depth of our lake, which averages 6.3. The shallowest is in the lighter colors. The dark is the deeper. And we never really had any infestations of milfoil in the darker colored portions of the lake, but only in the lighter. It was introduced in the very north bay of our lake, which is that little finger, as it's noted up top. Okay, next slide. This slide will show a 2019 80-site pre-treatment survey that was done. On the left is shows all plant distributions within our lake, and you can see it's heaviest where it's a darker red, and moderate where it's blue, and lightest where it's light blue. I believe that yellow spot is where we found alpine pondweed, the one species that was threatened or endangered species. On the right is the distribution of Eurasian milfoil in the fall of 2019. Even though I said it started in the North Bay, every time the harvesting would begin each year, they'd start in that North Bay, so you can see they made some progress where there are some yellow dots there, but primarily through the process of harvesting and recreational use on our lake, the milfoil had distributed almost all portions of the lake 8 foot and under in depth. We'll go on to the next slide. This gives a history of our management of the lake and the harvesting, et cetera. So the blue line represents the dive hours. We did a rapid response technique with some boys from Paul Smith College that started AIM, and Aquatic Invasive Management, and we hit our lake hard, and we seemed to get control of it through the years of 2007, 8, 9, 10, and got down to what would be ideally our maintenance level in 2011. We let off on the throttle a little bit too much in terms of monitoring and dive hours, et cetera, and we should have kept it up, but we didn't, and therefore the milfoil regained and just redistributed through our lake and repopulated itself and grew real aggressively. With that, we were introduced to dash harvesting, which was real applicable to our lake. It's a great way to harvest high volume, and so we, even to the extent that we bought our own boat and to bring our labor costs down, and it had worked wonders for us. But in the end, the orange line, the amount harvested, reached a new, what seemed to be our maintenance level of about 80,000 pounds. That's 40 tons of milfoil pulled out of our small little 80-acre lake, which only 40 acres of it had milfoil, where we had a maintenance level of 2 or 3,000 pounds back in 2011. Now we have a maintenance level of 80,000 pounds a year. And so the use of an herbicide was very appealing to us. I will say at this point, I'll elaborate more on cost. We were spending $70,000 a year, similar to Dan Kelting's graph of if you spend 70 right off the bat and you hit it hard, you can knock it down and you reduce your costs over time. We did that back in 2018. I think we spent $25,000 to $30,000, and we got it down to a maintenance level, but then we lost control of it again. Why don't we go to the next slide? We'll talk more about, this is the treatment map that was proposed and submitted with a permit to the APA. You can see it also correlates with the depth of the lake and the populations through our survey of milfoil and its locations. We didn't treat the entire lake, but we got results in the entire lake, which was nice. This was approved in May of this year, and we applied in June. We'll go on to the next. A little bit in detail about ProcellaCOR itself. It's I have the spec sheet on it right here in front of me. It is a selective systemic herbicide for controlling freshwater aquatic vegetation. It's called an auxin mimic. It's listed there. It causes elongation of the plant cells. It causes it to essentially outgrow itself. It's putting it on steroids, and then therefore the cells break down. They can't keep up with themselves. The cells break down and they die. Leaves will grow larger, become twisted. We saw that. The stems lengthened, and that tissue becomes fragile. It did take about 2 to 3 weeks to disappear. It stayed in the water column. It stood as a plant. I was getting a little nervous. 2 weeks out, I didn't see it falling, and then about 2.5, 3 weeks out, it disappeared. You want to apply it to the plant while it's growing. We had to delay the application because the plant hadn't grown. They wanted a foot of new growth. Apparently, it has more effect on new growth. So as opposed to applying in late May, we waited till the second week of June. Next slide. One of our criteria was it did have low recreational impact, environmental impact, and the cost was a factor too. So you can see that it was listed on the EPA as a reduced risk herbicide in 2018. You can read here it's less harmful to plants, birds, fish, lower potential for groundwater contamination, and lower application rates. We'll go on to the next. Getting tight on time. The half-life of it breaks down fairly quickly, 4 to 6 days aerobically, and then 2 days anaerobically in an aquatic setting. Also listed below is the toxicity. It has the least toxic values for fish and birds, mammals, amphibians, and slightly toxic for invertebrates. And the next slide. It didn't, not that people drink out of our lake, but it did not affect the drinking water if they did. Swimming, there was no restrictions on that. Fishing, no restrictions on that. And irrigation, we had one nursery downstream. They were worried about groundwater. They waited 3 days until the parts per billion were lower than 1, and not that they even needed to, but it never affected their ability to irrigate their plants. So it just I think here's one more slide actually. If we were to, this slide basically kind of gives a relative, it gives a visual as to how little chemical you actually use. We applied 8.7 gallons of the chemical in Minerva Lake for 41 acres. I'll talk a little bit about application costs and then the future, and we'll move on to question and answer. The application was done by an airboat. They mixed the solution on the boat, and they applied it below the surface of the water. They drove around the lake, and as they drove it, a GPS system collected the data on its location. They essentially called it painting the lake. They could see where they had been and where they needed to go based on the map that they were given. So it went fairly quickly. It took about 3 hours. The cost was to us for the chemical application was $14,900. That works out to about $360 per acre. Not sure that's correlates, you know, that would be the same, but and or almost $2,000 per gallon for the product. It is expensive, but it's effective. Is it gone for good? We don't know. Is it gone for now? Yes, it is. They say you can reapply every 2 to 3 years is necessary. You don't want to reapply year after year after year. There could be some resistance built up to it. In the sake of time, we'll start entertaining questions now. I think I've given you the highlights and the bullet points, but we're very pleased with it, and we're having our post-treatment survey done tomorrow with the rate toss at 80 different sites within our lake, so we'll have data on that. We have been around in boats, looking at the lake, surveyed it as much as last week, and did not see any presence of milfoil. So it's been a great success for our lake.
Can I add something?
Steve wanted to add a little bit.
Yeah, Dave and I have been on this project for 15 years, and we've seen the peaks and we've seen the valleys on this with the hand harvesting, the dash. We go out on the lake weekly now to inspect the lake, and as currently we have not found one stem of milfoil, which is fantastic. But as elected officials in this town being owned by the town, or majority of the lake being owned by the town, there was a lot of questions and answers from the residents and visitors on the safety of this. So we had to do quite a campaign and have public hearings on the safety of this product before the application. I think people were very, very interested, but they were also, you know, they took the time and they did the research themselves, and we've been very pleased with this, and we haven't heard anything negative. So, but, you know, there is going to be a public campaign before any application because people are concerned about safety. Thank you.
That's excellent, Steve. And that actually brings me, I'll make our first question. What downstream approvals did you need, and who did you have to notify downstream?
So we notified everybody, I think it was within 2 miles downstream. We sent out letters. We had to do stream side postings as well. And they were included in the comment period. You know, they were notified of the comment period while the application process was going through the APA. As I said, the one nursery was the one who had questions to us, and we got with the consultant and clarified them. They were nervous about their groundwater supplied pond that they use for irrigation, and that was it. We had 3 sites that we had to test post-application at 12 hours, 24 hours, 3 days, and 7 days after the application downstream of the lake. And that data came back that after 3 days, it was less than 1 part per billion at all test sites.
Follow up to that, as a follow up to all of our, this whole day, one question is, can you share what campaign materials you use to show residents? So maybe if you guys have any copies of that, you can share it with me and I'll share it with participants for today.
We put together a PowerPoint presentation with bullets that had a lot of history of our lake and how we got where we got today and what we've been doing. And then we actually had the lake management company come and do their own presentation. They didn't have materials in a PowerPoint, but spoke to our residents as well and answered questions. But we'll pass along what we had.
Yeah, with this chemical treatment, the transparency is the key point. You have to have the public hearings. You've got to reach out to the community. You've got to get them all the information they need. I think we did a pretty good job at that, and we'll do some more follow-up in the fall when people settle down and the COVID's over. We'll do some more hearings on it. But transparency from day one, what our intentions were, I think we did a pretty good job of that, and it's very important.
Absolutely. And that's a best management practice, you know, for anything you're doing in terms of managing on a lake or on terrestrial sites. We have a lot of questions for you guys. So, and we have saved a little bit of time, so I'm going to keep going. I'm going to combine two questions. So for application, are there difference between a stagnant lake versus a faster flowing lake? And did you have curtains around the area, or how did you control the treatment area? Can it be used for smaller spot treatments without curtains? So it's really about the nuts and bolts of application.
Yeah, it was not, there was no curtains used whatsoever. We had a slide there. It activates and has its effect within 12 to 24 hours on the plant. And therefore, since it's such a quick acting product, you don't have to contain it. But as I said earlier, we got the intended results plus a little bit more. There was some dilution and drift into the areas of the lake, for instance, where the alpine pondweed was, that it did reach by dispersion. And it affected and took care of the milfoil, even in areas we didn't treat near the treatment site. So we were thankful for that, but you know, in the end, it was, I guess does that answer the question?
I think so. And we can elaborate more at the end too, if anything comes to you.
Yeah, would it be applied? Could you use it in a smaller treatment area? I believe so. I mean, given that we had 41 acres, it made sense to use the airboat, and they had to remix the solution at least 3 times when they were on the water. They used the chemicals, which are in 2-gallon jugs, 2 to 3 gallon jugs, and they take lake water into their, into the container and remix the solution and concentrate, and then they use the dispensing unit, I guess, on the boat to then, as I said, paint the lake. There probably would be, the airboat technique was good because we had such a volume to cover. They probably would have another opportunity to maybe use a different technique on a smaller area, but I think it would be as effective.
Yeah, I just received the text from Glenn Sullivan, our consultant for Solitude, and he said it's excellent for spot treatment as far as that goes. So, probably wouldn't apply it with a boat, but maybe a smaller unit.
Okay. That leads us to the question of what was the effect on other plants?
So I thought I had a slide about it, but there's water shield, and then the lilies that were the two. Yeah, there was a slide I didn't show. It had an effect on the water shield in that we could see. We tried to apply prior to the water shield growing in the lake. That was one of our goals, but we had to hold back to let the milfoil grow. As I said, they wanted 1 foot of new growth. So there was some water shield present at the time of the application. You could see the water shield curling, as they described, and growing on the surface, and it was abnormally deformed. And some of that eventually died, but it came back. The water lilies, the new blooms on the plants, the flowers, wilted. But within a week, there were new blossoms coming up off those lily pads. So it did hinder their growth, but it didn't kill them and take them out of the lake. So.
And then last question, and we have a lot of questions for this, so we'll hold some of them to the end. So it has to do with monitoring and post-application testing and monitoring. So in your monitoring, what's the cost of all of the post-application? Are nutrients being studied in any of your monitoring in general before and after? And is that, potentially part of the issue, the root of the cause? And then for long-term effects on other plants, is that being included in your monitoring as well?
Yeah, the monitoring costs us, the monitoring costs about $2,500 pre-treatment, $2,500 post-treatment. That includes the 80 rake toss sites, and they do plant sampling. They quantify them, they identify them and quantify them. And so that's the extent to which we're doing it. We've had chemical nutrient testing and chemical testing done on our lake, but that is not included in this. We have not hired anyone to do that this year. Our lake is pretty well balanced pH-wise and other nutrients. Eutrophic, I think is the word they use for us. But we're not doing that as a part of the post-treatment survey.
Our lake has a town municipal beach and campground on it. So we do continuous testing on water quality for the health department throughout the summer.
So that's where you're including your nutrients, your pH, and general water quality for human health. We've got a couple more questions for you guys, and we'll ask them at the end about, including rare plants and native plants in your surveys. So and I think maybe the other parties in this discussion can help answer some of those questions. Thank you for going into such incredible detail. That was really excellent, and we're gonna keep diving in. So our next speaker, go ahead, Mary.
Thanks, Emily. Our next speaker is Lee Wollrath from the APA, and he's going to talk about navigating the permitting process. So I will turn it over to you, Lee. Lee, are you on mute?
Can you hear me now?
I can. Great.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so I'll just begin again. Thank you very much for having me speak today. It seems like it's a great fit for the other topics that you've selected, and it's great that I can go last and talk about what would be the next steps if you were looking to do a management action. So I'm going to go through our permitting process as it involves aquatic management. And that is the park agency reviews projects that are involving what's called involving wetlands. So in other words, if you're having a management action that is affecting vegetation and the vegetation is of an area that's large enough to constitute a wetland under our regulations, then we have review authority over the management action that's taking place. So just to begin with, I want to just kind of have a couple of comments and disclaimers. The first is that we manage permitting for activities involving wetlands, but there are other permitting needs, specifically the Department of Environmental Conservation, and for some management actions, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And so the topic that I'm discussing today is just park agency permitting. Nothing to do with other permitting from other entities, and it kind of highlights when you have a project why coming to all of the agencies early and discussing your project is important, so that everyone gets going on the same page and you understand where the potential pitfalls are in permitting, and you understand who all is going to be needed in the permitting process. You don't want to go through a permitting process to find that you're 6 months into it and then you realize you've missed one of the agencies that's involved. So, it's very important to reach out early when you're doing this. And also, I want to, emphasize that all management actions that you do have an impact. It's ecological or economic, and that's part of the permitting process. Is we're looking to avoid or minimize those impacts, especially the ecological impacts associated with a project. And so when I show up and I'm asked to go and look at a lake because of an aquatic invasive species problem or some other problem, it's already kind of a problem, right? you kind of don't want me there. The best thing is prevention with aquatic invasive species, and that's why, you know, supporting the boat steward programs and spread prevention control programs are just so critical, because it gets expensive and it gets difficult and it gets frustrating, and you just don't need to be there. If you're on your lake, you should be enjoying the lake and not just working tirelessly to try and manage an issue that had manifested because somebody, you know, brought in an invasive in. So with that said, let's get started. We'll start with the next slide, please. So for the park agency, this slide shows a beautiful wetland in Lake George. This is considered a wetland subject agency jurisdiction, very small wetlands that only are a couple hundred square feet in size can be wetlands. Oftentimes people don't realize that the plants in the lake bottom represent wetlands that are jurisdictional to us. They are, and our jurisdiction extends out to 2 meters water depth as measured at mean low water. So if you're affecting plants between 2 meters mean low water depth and the shoreline, chances are you're affecting a wetland. You can actually have activities going on next to the wetland that affect that wetland, and that would also be a jurisdictional activity for us. An example would be dredging. If you're dredging in 10 feet of water, which I'm not sure why you would unless there's contaminants, and you have a turbidity curtain that encloses within an area of wetland vegetation that's in 3 feet of water, we would have review authority over that dredging project. Next slide. This is a bed of variable leaf milfoil. This is a wetland that's subject to our jurisdiction. So our jurisdiction isn't just for wetland vegetation that is native. It is for monocultures of invasive species as well. Next slide. So what I'm going to speak about today are management activities that are involving wetlands, and primarily I'm going to be focusing on invasive species management, and those are, or actually I should say lake management activities that aren't commercial or residential development. So I X'd out docks and boathouses. If you put a dock in a wetland that's subject to our jurisdiction, or a boathouse that's in a wetland that's subject to our jurisdiction, you need a permit from us. I'm not going to speak about that today. I'm going to speak about the other management options or management options for lakes such as triploid grass carp stocking or benthic barriers, diver-assisted suction harvesting, that sort of thing. Next slide. Before we begin, I'm going to just go through and show you where our permitting ends up landing. This is a slide that shows since about 2010 where all the permits have gone that have come into the agency. This is lake management activities. This is not aquatic invasive species management. Some of these activities are only for for native vegetation management, and some of them are only maintenance dredging for like a marina or something like that. But it just gives you an understanding of where our work is. And what it also, I put the slide up to kind of highlight that we do a lot of permitting for both aquatic invasive species and other lake management or lake concerns. The permitting process, with one exception, is the same, and what it really comes down to is the criteria for approval. So the criteria for approving an aquatic invasive species management action in a lake is somewhat different than the criteria for approving a management action that doesn't involve an aquatic invasive species. So next slide. So all of the management actions in water bodies for lake management activities are considered major permits. Major permits can be issued or processed as a major permit application, which is the bulk of them. But there is a subset, and Dan spoke about this with regards to the permitting earlier, about we have a general permit process for certain activities. And what it is a general permit is actually a permit where we've had a lot of experience with the activity, and we have already essentially reviewed and approved a portion of what the project is. So we are able to rapidly approve future management activities proposed by somebody. So the general permit that we actually have two of them. The general permit is for hand harvesting, and I'll talk about the diver-assisted suction harvesting included in the general permit in a few moments, and benthic barrier installations. And the permit allows for, the general permit gets issued 15 days from completion of an application, but you must meet certain qualifications. And so, as you can see in the bottom of the slide, what we need are landowner signatures of the lake bottom, plant survey or other surveys, and we need to have the authorized rep professional services. Going back to what Dan said, is we need to understand that the people doing the action certainly understand what the invasive species is and how to handle appropriately the management of those species. You know, in my job as doing lake management activities, I do go to individual landowner sites, and as well as go and speak with lake associations. And for some groups or some people, I will go and with an understanding when I first show up that I'm going to be looking at an aquatic invasive species, only to find out that it's a native species. So that kind of highlights why that public education, APIPP doing the invasive species identification is very helpful. It helps us with going through this. So you know, those are the types of activities that have to be, or actions that have to be met in order to go through the general permit process. Next slide. So the permit that we issue most often, the general permit is number 2015 G2. It's available to just individual lake associations or groups that are looking to do management in their own lake. You can find it on our agency's website under general permits. It's a pretty simple form. I would say that the two two biggest obstacles to getting a permit to hand harvest or install benthic barriers are not having a plant survey, which is required by the permit, and then also understanding and getting sign off of the ownership of the water body. With regards to the ownership, I would say that is probably one of the biggest obstacles. What ends up happening is people don't know who the lake bottom owner is, or if they do have the lake bottom owner, it's difficult sometimes to get the lake bottom owner to actually sign an application. Not so much for aquatic invasive species management, but other management activities. I've had instances where the lake bottom is partially owned by somebody, and a management action of triploid grass carp is being proposed, but that one lake bottom owner refuses to sign the application because he doesn't want carp on his property. That application basically goes nowhere because you don't have ownership of the water body sign off on the proposed action. So, next slide. We're pretty creative in trying to get around and meet the needs of the permitting for the general permit. With regards to the plant surveys, we will scour whatever material we may find to try and accommodate plant surveys. We rely heavily on APIPP's work and the Adirondack Lakes and the Adirondack Watersheds Alliance's work, Institute's work. I'm sorry, Dan. And we also scour peer-reviewed literature. So if we can find a plant survey, you know, we can help avoid that cost. In some instances, however, if you look at what I highlighted in yellow there, one of a more recent APIPP survey, they're saying, you know, they're not doing comprehensive surveys of all native plants. And so in those instances, we're hesitant to issue a general permit just based upon the APIPP report. If the water body is small enough and I have time, I can go and supplement that, or we can try to work to supplement it somehow. In some instances, we can issue the general permit, but then we put conditions on the general permit, which, for instance, would say you can only use hand harvesting techniques, but you can't use benthic mats unless you do the survey. And the concern there is if you are if you're matting protected species that we want to preserve, we don't want to have the benthic barriers there, and plant surveys are necessary to understand whether or not those species are present in the first place. Next slide. With regards to diver-assisted suction harvesting, in 2015, we issued the general permit. In 2016, we were approached by a company that just does diver-assisted suction harvesting. This is a company working actually in Minerva Lake. they reached out to us and said, well, you know, can we operate under the general permit? So we took a look at the actual process of general diver assisted suction harvesting, and we basically said yes, provided you can meet these criteria. So basically what we said to them is you can use a diver assisted suction harvester under the general permit, provided you are using it essentially as a plant conveyance device only, and you're not suction dredging any sediments, and that suction intake has to be a sufficient distance from the sediment. You can't result in resuspension of sediments from the discharged water. In other words, these devices pump not just the plant, but massive volumes of water. And that water has to, they filter the water through screens to collect the plant fabrics, fragments, and then the water gets discharged back into the lake. And if it's done inappropriately, it can come out at a high water velocity that resuspends sediments. So we said, you know, essentially you have to have a diffuser on the boat that doesn't result in discharge, you know, like a direct pipe discharge into the water body. So they basically just put a plate in, a diffusing plate that allows the water to go back in more slowly. And then the other thing is that the diver assisted suction harvesting boats are collecting a lot of materials, and they can get messy, and that they have to do fragment collection with regards to them. Next slide. So just a couple of quick examples of what we see. At the end of the slideshow, if I have time, I'll get into this with major projects. But these are the types of things that we see and we're concerned about when we talk about, you know, management actions cause ecological or economic impacts as well. Here's a diver assisted suction harvesting boat that's being operated, and it has a faulty intake pipe, and so the sediment is being that is surrounding the root mass that's being sucked up into the boat is being discharged into the lake and not being filtered out very well. And so this is an instance where this boat was not operating in accordance with our conditions under the general permit. Next slide. And like we received, you know, we obtained a lot of guidance, a lot of experience dealing with installation of benthic barriers for Asian clams in Lake George. We authorized approximately 8 acres of benthic barrier installation to try and eradicate Asian clams from the south end of Lake George, and in the process learned an awful lot. We found barriers had, in one instance, followed a very large boat, which ended up having to be towed off to a marina and hauled out of the water to have the barrier removed at the cost of the entity undertaking the project. We also saw locations, if you see in the bottom right corner of the slide, where benthic barriers were installed right up on the shoreline at motels, basically eliminating that motel's ability to offer any kind of water access recreation on their very expensive shoreline property on Lake George for an entire season. Those divers there are carrying bundles of reinforcing rods, steel reinforcing rod that you get at your contractor store. You know, that ends up being, you know, sharp and in the water and rusting. So, you know, there are issues associated with it. I will say that benthic barriers in the Adirondack Park seem to be not a very favored management technique anymore. I think that we have requirements that require the barriers to only be installed for a season. They have to be removed at the end of the season. In Lake George, we are finding some of the barriers were getting covered with up to 6 inches of sand in one season from wave action. Those get to be very difficult to remove, leaving them in the water body so that they can foul boats or damage other property or just be plastic garbage in the water body is not really a viable option in our opinion. So barriers can be affordable, but they come at a large cost. The other thing with the benthic barrier is our general permit requires allows you to benthic barrier an area for a certain period of time, but then you're obligated to hand harvest any invasive species that may take root in the barren area that you had barriered initially. When you clear out the plants, one of the things is invasive species tend to, as a theory, like disturbed sites. And so you've just disturbed the site. You basically own the site once you put a barrier down, and you own it for a certain period of time, and you're obligated to take care of it. Next slide. So now we'll talk about major permits. Major permits are any of the activities that are not covered under a general permit when it comes to lake management activities. This is a, this would include dredging or stocking of triploid grass carp or herbicide treatment, lake drawdowns, any of the other activities, mechanical harvesters. And so the timeframes with the general permit, we generally would get a permit out within 15 days of a complete application. For a major permit, we have 15 days just to review whether or not the application is complete. So all of a sudden you realize that the time frame for getting a major permit or getting a permit that's under the major is can be greatly extended. We have 15 days from receipt of an application to determine completeness. If it's deemed incomplete, we send out a notice of incomplete permit application if we determine that more information is needed. Usually, the more complex the project, the more likely that that is to occur. And it's not unusual for 1, 2, or even 3 notice of incomplete permit applications to be sent out on any given project. Each time we send it out, it basically is a document that goes back to the applicant that says, you need to do A, B, and C to get a complete application, or we have concerns, whatever the case may be. You respond, and if you modify your project, we may then come back and say, well, now that you've modified your project to address this concern, we have this issue, this question. And so it can drag out a permit process. This is another reason why going through the pre-application process and getting a good application in the first instance is very critical if you're going to get through the permitting process in a timely fashion. So once we determine the application to be complete, we have 60 days to determine if a public hearing is required. And if no public hearing is required, we have 90 days from the date of the application being complete to issue a permit. So we can go very fast if necessary. I think our fastest for doing Asian clam benthic matting in Lake George, where we already had a lot of plant surveys provided by Darren Freshwater Institute. We had already visited the sites. We were able to do the entire process in about 45 or 50 days. So we can go fast, but if you take a look at this, if you do 2 or 3 notice of incomplete permit applications, and then you get a complete application, and then it takes us 45 days to go through and get a permit out the door, that is an entire growing season. You know, if you submitted an application in May or June for a major project, chances are you're not doing that project that year. It would be for the next year. So again, just leading, planning on having a lot of time in advance of actually undertaking the project is important. Next slide. Here's an example. These are real examples of different timeframes that we have for review. I did my best. I looked at our database to try and give you an understanding of when a pre-application process starts and when we receive an application. Sometimes we have informal conversations before we formally open up a pre-application, as is the case with the top one, Minerva Lake. Dave indicated that we were talking to Minerva in October of 2018. So you went from October of 2018, we actually started formal process when we sat down with Minerva Lake, their consultant, and the New York State DEC in July of 2019. They went and started to do their work with the consultant. We received an application in February of this year. In May of this year, we issued the permit. DEC issued the permit at about the same time. I think they were a few days ahead of us, maybe a few weeks ahead of us. Our process from the start of the pre-application, which was a good 9 months before initially talking about the project, to issuance of a permit was nearly a year. It can get long. If you take a look at Lake Iesca, which is over just west of Old Forge and Inlet, they were looking to install triploid grass carp. We talked to them in 2015. We ended up receiving an application in 2018 and gave them a permit a few months later, and they spent over 1,000 days. And so some of these issues end up being, Lake Iesca, it ends up being difficult in some regards. they had a hard time trying to figure out where to put a fish barrier. And so we evaluated a piece of property where a fish barrier would go. Everything seemed fine. The piece of property changed hands, and the new owners refused to allow a fish barrier on the property. So that set them back months and months. And that's completely out of our control. We're not going to issue a permit for something on a person's property where they're not going to sign the application, as I said before. Loon Lake was another herbicide treatment. We did pre-application in January of 2012. They went 421 days before they got their permit. And Marion River, which was the general permit, that was 10 days after receipt of an application before we got a permit out. We had a plant survey already that we found acceptable, and they had already received approval from the Department of Environmental Conservation. So I think the total process for that one was like 45 days or so. Still very, very short in relation to the others. And then Lake George, I put out here, which is a project that was which was also ultimately disapproved by our agency's board. They started a pre-application process in 1986, and the formal application process began in 2000 I think that's supposed to be 1993. I apologize, and it ended up being disapproved after years of work. So that kind of is when we talk about lake management actions. From my perspective, I don't want anyone to be in that position. I want somebody to be in the Minerva Lake or the Loon Lake situation where there's some lead time towards a project. The issues get addressed early, and the lake associations or the municipalities are really listening to the permitting entities with regards to potential issues of concern. I don't think when you take a look at the Lake George project of a denial of sonar, that did anyone, Lake George or anyone else, any good. It's getting a disapproval. I think that it creates a stigma. I think that, makes permitting possibly the next one, raises, concerns even more. So higher levels of scrutiny. I think addressing the concerns that are raised by the regulating authorities is very important, not only for your water body, but for other water bodies as well. Next slide. So the application for a major project, and so this would be an herbicide or carp or anything, ends up always being a general information request, and then there will always be something else. General information request is asking for adjoining landowner information, landowner name, signature by the landowner, and a general description of what's being proposed with some other additional information. And then the additional information that we ask for is either comes in a formal application, like a supplemental information request, like we have for triploid grass carp. With herbicides, what we tried to do was we took a look back when just after Loon Lake's permitting, and found that the DEC's permit application and the park agency's permit applications were pretty similar, but they're not quite the same. And so we greatly reduced permitting requirements by simply accepting DEC's application, provided that a few additional items were provided. Some things are not required by the DEC for permitting, and we asked for them. And so it's basically a DEC application, our general information request, and then some supplemental information. And then large-scale dredging, we may ask for specific littoral zone habitat inventories or other specific studies to understand the impacts. Next slide. So for major projects, and this is different than than the general permit that I talked about earlier, every adjoining landowner associated with the project or adjacent to the project becomes notified. So for an herbicide application at Minerva Lake, every landowner around the lake was notified by mail. There's also a public notice that goes out in the New York State DEC's Environmental Notice Bulletin, and there's an opportunity for public comment. We can issue permits at the staff level without going to the agency board, which is the monthly board meeting. Given whether or not it goes to a board will depend on how unique the project is, how much public interest there is, or how much public opposition there is. These types of projects that are going to the board, or actually until a permit is signed for any major project, you don't really know if you're going to get approved until the permit is actually issued. Agency staff like myself can intimate whether or not something is likely to be issued or we don't see any concerns, but until it actually gets signed and is out the door, there is a layer of review that that we make recommendations and it goes through, you know, additional reviews. So, you know, it's important to understand that. And one of the things we do when we're doing guidance to lake associations is we understand that money is tight. We're not going to be out there suggesting to people that a project is fine when we have concerns with it. We indicate where we have concerns and we try to direct people in a direction that allows us to make a recommendation for approval, so that you don't end up in, say, that Lake George scenario. Next slide. And so this is my last slide. If I have time, I can get into some other stuff. I'm not sure where I am on time. But basically what happens, and this is where approving aquatic invasive species management actions tend to be different than, say, a lake management action to control native vegetation. We have wetlands are value rated by law, by our regulations, and they go from 1 through 4. If it's a wetland that's associated with open water, like your lake, then there are only 3 values. The 4th value is only a wetland that you would find up in the landscape and not in open water. The highest value wetland is a value rating of 1, and it requires the preservation of the entire wetland with no degradation or loss. So these activities that we commonly, or actually occasionally, a permit typically involve, a good example would be New York State Department of Transportation has to realign a road for safety purposes. They're going to be impacting a value 1 wetland. We can issue a permit for that. We do look for avoidance. We do look for minimization, and we look for alternatives. And just like with the Department of Transportation example, if you're a lake association and you are looking to do a management action, we are going to be looking to help you manage your aquatic invasive species, but at the same time, we are obligated to make sure that we are preserving the entire wetland with no degradation or loss. You know, we do have at the top, you'll see that unless the economic, social, and other benefits are determined, we have to, you know, we can't issue a permit. Even if there is a economic and social and other benefit, we still are obligated to find the action that minimizes the impact to wetlands. And then, you know, going through value 2, you can see the approval criteria is a little bit less, and then value 3 wetlands is just a little bit less than a value 2. So as you go up the scale, a value 1 wetland becomes difficult to get a permit for, and then value 3 is somewhat less. So with that, I guess I'm done, unless I have time to go through some specific actions.
Unfortunately, I don't think we will, but we can share that in some of the follow-up information. So thank you, Lee. I can see why you emphasize so much prevention in order to not have to even go through, because even the most minimal management practice that requires a permit the permit process in and of itself is time intensive and energy intensive, but the Adirondack Park Agency is here to help, to ask questions in that pre-application process in and of itself, so that you can have everything on time and completed correctly with the right documentation. So going forward, we have now, it's 11:16, so I'm going to adjust everything a little bit. We'll have 10 minutes to cover questions that weren't covered before, and then Mary and I can wrap up in our last 5 minutes so we can let everyone go on time today. So having to do with the specific question thrown out there for Lee is, have you ever approved of use of a chemical control such as ProcellaCOR in a wetland, in a jurisdictional wetland?
That is our jurisdiction. So Minerva Lake, anything less than 2 meters that was vegetated was the wetland that we were issuing the permit for.
That's a good question, because that also gets into, you know, even what Dan Kelting said in the very beginning of scoping, surveying, where are your plants occurring? And so just the habit of a lot of aquatic invasive species that are growing from the benthic layer, they're going to be occurring in shallower depths of water, which inherently fall under the jurisdictional wetland.
That's correct, yeah.
Yeah. That was a really interdisciplinary question. So the answer is yes. If you guys don't mind, I'll take a few steps back, and I think Lee can actually help answer a lot of these questions because it's the questions he asked when, you know, even Minerva Lake was applying for these applications. So going back to the dash and challenges of using a dash, because you talked about fragmentation and you talked about sedimentation, or pulling up sediment, and going to Dan Kelting's method or preferred method of management. Is it a fair, the question is it a fair comparison of looking at, you know, pounds of plants removed and pounds of material removed when you're using a dash, like in the Minerva Lake example, after, you know, the curve was flattened, and then, you know, a little bit of time goes by and the curve is no longer flattened and they had to use the dash. You know, even though it's filtered, even though the material removed is filtered, what the dash takes out contains much more dirt than and sediment than when removed by hand. For once in my life, that is not my dog barking, so I'm not going to apologize for that now. So what are some challenges in using a dash, even though it's kind of like a nuclear option? It's a real hammer rather than a fine tooth comb.
Can I answer that? Because I've used both.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, so first I just want to correct, hand harvesting, scuba hand harvesting is definitely not my preferred
Okay.
method. It's just the method that we use. Although I've used both, and I think that you know, Steve and Dave characterized the dash is a very good option when you're working in dense areas. But the challenge that you have with it, so I've used one. I've used them down in Old Forge and Fulton Chain. Pulling all that volume, you're pulling so much water. And if you're working in an area where it's not 100% variable leaf milfoil or 100% Eurasian, everything is getting sucked into that hose. So you're not able to separate the other plants, non-target plants from target plants. So it's very difficult to manage that and try to stay true to just removing the invasives. It's fairly cumbersome. I noticed the hoses break quite a bit. The joints break. You get a lot of plant material. Fragments actually can get spewed out into the lake. There's a lot more mechanics going on than the traditional system, so it requires a lot more attention than just having a hookah rig and a diver in a bag. But I think that but for dense areas, the dash system is a better method in terms of productivity, and it can, you know, my personal observation and just anecdotal talking to other people, you can do a much better job removing the root material, although then you're getting down into the sediments. So yeah, so I think I just wanted to say that you've got these two options. I don't think one is necessarily better than the other. It depends on the application.
Which also kind of goes back again to the importance of surveying, of understanding what is there, understanding what's needed. So communicating with partners, reaching out to resources in your community of, you know, the folks who are represented here. Is it, you know, reach out to Mary at the Adirondack Lakes Association, reach out to ERIN at APIPP, or reach out to myself at APIPP. Maybe we can help you talk about what sort of monitoring is needed. Talk to Lee to say, hey, maybe we're thinking about these challenges that we want to approach next year. Reach out to the Adirondack Watershed Institute to say, I know you've worked with XYZ. What were your ups and downs, or do you know any contractors to reach out to? So we do have one comment that the use of ProcellaCOR has only been permitted once in our region, and maybe Lee can talk a bit more about that, and the folks from Minerva Lake can talk more about that. And at Minerva Lake is the first use of this product. But it might not.
I'd be happy to.
Okay, go ahead.
So with regards to ProcellaCOR, and you know, I hear Steve and Dave being enthusiastic about it, and I'm cautiously optimistic, I would say. You know, we're in the first year of the first treatment. And the word eradication should just be stricken from conversation here. There is no demonstration of eradication yet. We don't know if it can eradicate. As Dan indicated, there's a seed bed in there. The ProcellaCOR doesn't affect the seed bed. We don't know how long the seeds will remain viable in the lake. We do know that the application that was submitted for Minerva Lake was estimating a 95 to 99% efficacy for the plants. I believe one of the reasons why they say that is that when they apply, in order for the herbicide to be effective, you have to meet a concentration at all locations that's lethal. And that's not just lethal for the vegetative growth, but it's lethal for the entire plant, including the root structure. So we don't know if there are root fragments that weren't growing to an amount large enough or didn't have enough vegetative growth to take up enough ProcellaCOR to actually be lethal. What we do know is the same claims were made for Renovate at Loon Lake and Lake Luzerne, 95 to 99%. So Loon Lake is the one example where I can point to and say, yeah, the year they did the treatment, there was a 99% efficacy, probably 100%. We just don't know. I mean, it cleared the area, just like ProcellaCOR cleared Minerva Lake. And they didn't have to hand harvest that year in that area, and that was 2013. They didn't have to hand harvest in 2014, but they hand harvested that area in 2015, and they've hand harvested that area 2017, 2018, 2019, and now 2020. And so this is a product that was used at treatment concentrations, just like ProcellaCOR was, and it is the same. It's an auxin mimic that's systemic, and it was deemed an effective treatment. So this is one of the issues that I really caution people when they look at ProcellaCOR or any other herbicide. It's a hammer in a toolbox. You know, it may work, it may be appropriate for what you're doing, but it might not be. But don't think that you are going to get eradication out of it. That has not been demonstrated yet. Could it be? Maybe. I mean, we'll find out in a few years. But until then, you just don't know. So, you know, that's the caution I have. And I think that there's an unrealistic sometimes expectation for an herbicide or a management action, and then at the end of the day, it doesn't really live up to what people had expected or what was believed to have happened. And so I just caution people against, about that.
And also that highlights the importance of also having a plan for after the treatment, that, somebody will have to go in years, next year, the year after, and survey and have a plan for continuing management.
And that's one of the reasons why Minerva Lake was a good fit for it, because they have demonstrated their long-term commitment, and they fully understood that they were going to be having to manage the area, and they have been very aggressive at managing. They understand that they made a mistake, and they should be commended for where they are and how aggressive they are at managing it, for sure.
And just to emphasize that, reach out to all the organizations who are here to help, support, and offer technical assistance, even in asking these questions or thinking about what your plan might be missing or should include, because in different years with different scales, infestations are going to require different management techniques and different perspectives. And prevention is key. Keep it boring, keep it clean, keep it dry, keep it drained, and emphasizing that information to all of your lake users can prevent all of these bigger challenges, because it's kind of almost like a chronic illness, right? It could get better, but it's always going to be there, and you have to manage it. you have to be paying attention to what the lake is experiencing at different times of year. In order to preserve and time, I think we might move on to some closing remarks. And if people have additional questions, feel free to email me and Mary, and we can try to answer those over time. And one thing I wanted to, so because prevention is key and that requires, you know, a paradigm shift and increasing awareness of invasive species and what they are and what they do and how we can take action as users of Adirondack Park and our waters and lands. We have additional workshops coming up that I'll send out information on. We have a family workshop coming out online next week, working with the VIC at Paul Smith's. It'll be a 1-hour online workshop where families can, you know, learn from the safety of home and then participate in socially distanced, self-guided activities out in the field to engage in STEM learning on the trails at the VIC. And then on August 25th, because this is a very creepy species we need to be looking out for, is an emerging species in the Adirondack region of invasive jumping worms, which are really freaky, weird animals that also have a lot to do with anglers and hiking. It has a lot to do with users of water and terrestrial spaces, so I hope you can join us for that as well. And then just please stay connected. We're on social media, we're on Facebook, and we're on Instagram. Check out all of our tools online and our resources for managing invasive species and for preventing the spread of invasive species at adkinvasives.com. And I'll be sending this recording out as a follow-up in addition to handouts of the event for today and ways to get onto our listserv and contact information for both Mary and myself. So please also send us questions. And thank you to our wonderful speakers. This is fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you.